Welcome to the New Atlas Live. I'm Brian Berletic. Today is September 4th, 2023, and joining me today is the Duran, Alex Christoforou and Alexander Mikuras. Joining us again, we're going to be talking about Ukraine, military-industrial output, and how it impacts the conflict in Ukraine, and much more, I'm sure. And welcome, everybody, and welcome, Alex and Alexander. How are you?
Very well. Very delighted to be with you again, Brian.
Doing well.
Thank you.
Doing well.
Thank you,
Brian.
Thank you. Thank you for coming on. So how about we do an update on where things are on the battlefield? I want to just show people real quick. I was reading this, and this is the BBC. They're claiming that Ukrainian troops punched through Russian line. And correct me if I'm wrong, and I will ask you both. Doesn't it seem like they're referring to the security zone or the gray zone that the Ukrainian forces at now exactly 3 months, they have finally passed through the security zone, or have they actually punched through one of these main defense lines that even the New York Times was talking about all the way back in December of last year? Maybe we'll start with Alexander.
Yeah, well, my own personal view is that not only is it only about the security zone, it's about the security zone in one place, which is this village of Rabotino, all of 480 people before the war. It's a small place. It's on not a hill, but a sort of elevation on the Zaporozhye front lines, ahead of the big fortified lines. The reports some 2 weeks ago, I think now, that there were even earlier reports that Rabotino had been captured. Turned out it hadn't been. Then there were more reports that it had been captured. We had those on Monday. And they're treating the capture of this village, which is perhaps not fully captured, but they're treating the capture of this village, this one place, as the breakthrough on the front lines. And there's been more attacks in other places. There's another village a little to the east called Verbovoye, where they're also attacking, but they haven't been able to take that village. And that's also, as I understand it, also the security zone. So my own personal view, actually, if you look at what's actually happening and disregard these headlines, over the last 2 weeks, 3 weeks, nothing very much has actually happened. They've not really succeeded in consolidating control of Rabotino. It seems part of the village remains contested. They're trying to sidestep this village by advancing through open fields to the left of it, but we're still talking about the security zone. They're trying to make attempts to capture this other village, which is Verbovoye, which they haven't captured. And that's it. That's the sum total of it. And I know we shouldn't accept uncritically Russian claims about Ukrainian casualties, and none of us are going to go into that morass of trying to estimate Ukrainian casualties. But what I would say is this: one thing the Russian figures perhaps do tell us is where the heaviest fighting has been. And if you actually look and track what the Russian Defense Ministry is saying, by far the largest number of Ukrainian casualties that they are claiming are not on the Zaporozhye front lines. They continue to be in fighting in and around Bakhmut. And that was again true earlier this morning, by the way. That's where the really intense fighting, according to the Russians, is taking place. And I think that is almost certainly correct.
And Alex, I want to bring up the map here real quick. This BBC article talking about this breakthrough. They show you the map, and they say down here in purple is held or regained by Ukraine. You can't even see it on the map where this has happened. You can see here at the ledge, but the dot for Rabotino is covering the actual territory they claim that they have taken. You've been following the media spin on all of this from the Western media. And I actually remember both of you actually doing videos about this one armored personnel carrier that may not even have been manned rumbling across one of these anti-tank ditches that was actually part of the defense line, and how they jumped to the conclusion that at that point, weeks ago, they had broken through the first line. So from your point of view, where's the media spin right now at this point? Why are they trying to make this out as a major breakthrough when you look at even the BBC map, which and this, by the way, is from the Institute for the Study of War, which is basically a Western propaganda outlet. How do you see this spin there, Alex?
Newland's family, Institute for the Study of War. Yeah.
Yeah,
I was like squinting, trying to like see the purple dot there, and that's 100. From what I understand, that's 100 plus kilometers from Rabotinia to the Sea of Azov. And the New York Times, they put out an article over the weekend, and they said that the gains that Ukraine is making is because they're making the gains on foot. Mm. They're not even taking vehicles or tanks into these areas, and they're going on foot. And then they said the Russians, they've figured this out and they're igniting the land. And anyway, the New York Times, the important part of this article was that, they're saying that Ukraine is making these gains because they changed their tactics, and now their tactic is to walk or run through these fields. Kirby says they're on the second line of defense now. If they don't capture Rabotinho, and if they're not on the second line of defense by the time Zelensky is in New York for the UN meeting, then the collective West has a problem, and they're going to have to cover all of this up. And me and Alexander, we did a video on this a couple of days ago, and we came to the conclusion that what they're going to do is they're just not going to talk about Rabotinho anymore. They're just going to stop talking about it. So I think they have 3-4 weeks before the weather changes. Zelensky's going to go to the United States for the UN meeting. Congress, from what I understand, is going to be back in session. They're going to take a bunch of votes on more funding for Ukraine, and the European leadership is also getting very jittery and panicky, and they want to see results as well. You have a bunch of elections. You have an election in Slovakia at the end of the month. You have an election in Poland coming up, and so I think they're trying to paint the narrative that Ukraine is somehow marching towards Melitopol or Mariupol. If you notice, all the headlines are Ukraine is one step closer to Melitopol, one step closer to Mariupol. Who are they kidding? Who are they kidding? If Ukraine was advancing at this pace, if they were really getting closer to these cities, they would not be firing the defense minister. It's that simple.
That is a good point. Actually, I was going to ask about that after this. One other thing. There are things like this, part of the media spin, articles like this from Forbes. They're talking about the Bayraktar TB2 drone. They're claiming that it's back, and all of this is based on one video of the drone taking out a Russian patrol boat, which would not be anywhere near the bulk of Russia's main air defenses, which is why it was able to take out this boat. So this is the type of information warfare that they are depending on to try to spin this as somehow still viable, this offensive. And another thing is the losses. In that BBC article, I do believe they cited maybe a Ukrainian soldier or an officer saying, we're gaining momentum, but this is now 3 full months. They're now in the 4th month of fighting. They have suffered catastrophic losses. They don't have anything left to make any sort of momentum with. So even if they do, and these defense lines were made to be breached and for Russia to move back step by step to absorb the Ukrainian assaults, where does it go from this? Is it a failed offensive, Alexander?
Well, as of this moment, one has to say yes. Now, I mean, there are constant attempts to change the definition of success and failure. So at one point it was, march all the way to the Sea of Azov. Then it was, capture Melitopol and bring your artillery close to the front lines so that you can intercept them, shell the Russian communications to Crimea. And I've now seen one report which says, broaden the breakthrough, the area where you've actually achieved this breakthrough, which, as I said, at the moment doesn't actually look particularly impressive or significant. And, other reports, well, we'll continue the offensive after the autumn and perhaps even in the spring. Or alternatively, if you can't do that, now talk, as they do in the Financial Times, that actually, because the soil in the southern Zaporozhye region is different from the soil in the north, you can continue the offensive through the autumn. But you change the story, you change the definitions. But ultimately, the key thing is we are 3 months. We've seen 3 months of this offensive. Ukraine has suffered very heavy losses. We don't need to go into a numbers game. The fact is, Ukraine itself is admitting that it has suffered very heavy losses. Its own intelligence chief, Budanov, who is a notable hardliner, is talking about very, very heavy losses. And they have nothing of significance territorially to show. They've not captured any important place. They've not yet breached any of the big Russian fortified lines. And if they do breach one of those fortified lines, there's several more beyond that. And as far as we can see, the Russians have kept most of their army back. They haven't yet committed it to the battle. So I would say, as of today, it looks to me like a failure.
And actually, I don't know whether it was Alex or Alexander's video today talking about, I think it was the military intelligence head talking about Russia moving reserves around Ukraine. They're at the end of their reserves. The forces that they prepared for this offensive, the very last of those brigades are now involved in the fighting. So it really does seem like Russia has significant forces remaining while Ukraine has exhausted themselves. So this is why I go back to saying, even if they do breach it at this point, it's not going to amount to anything. Now, before we talk about the defense minister's dismissal, I saw this earlier. Igor Kolomoisky, and for people who don't know, he's a Ukrainian oligarch, and he was one of the sponsors of these militias that were involved in the overthrow of the Ukrainian government in 2014, and all of the fighting everywhere ever since, including up to and including right now. I don't know much about this, so I wanted to ask Alexander and Alex what your thoughts are on this story.
Well, to me, it looks like, again, diverting attention away from the bad news at the battlefronts. You've sacked the defense minister. You don't want to openly admit that it's failed, that, his, conduct of the war has failed. So you talk more about corruption. And there's been this sudden burst of commentary in Ukraine. We're going to sort out corruption. We're going to fire all the commissars who've been involved in mobilization. Some of them have been taking bribes. Well, what a surprise. But anyway, we're now going to clean all of that out. We're also going to come after the oligarchs themselves. And Kolomoisky is, of course, an extraordinary personality. He's been a major figure in Ukrainian economic and business life for some time. He's also, by the way, had a historic presence in Cyprus, which I'm sure Alex knows a bit about. But anyway, he's been in many, many things. Putin himself, by the way, loathes him. They've had some dealings, and he just can't stand Kolomoisky, and he said some very critical things about him. But absolutely, Kolomoisky played a very important role back in 2014. He was appointed after the Maidan events, the seizure of power. He was made governor of the city the Ukrainians called Dnipro, which is the Russians called Dnipropetrovsk, one of the major industrial centers. This is very much his area of control. He had organized the football fans, apparently, in that particular city into a militia. Allegedly, that militia played a role in the Odessa fire incident, which is a notorious incident in this conflict when protesters, anti-government protesters in Odessa were burnt to death in this trade union building. So he was allegedly involved in all that. He's played apparently a big role sponsoring other militias. He's also, however, played a role in sponsoring Zelensky himself. Zelensky was an actor in a series, a TV series broadcast on one of Kolomoisky's television channels. He's historically controlled various television channels. And he was supposedly somebody who had great influence on Zelensky and had allegedly sponsored Zelensky's presidential campaign. So coming after Kolomoisky is to come after a person who's been a big figure in the Ukrainian economic, social, political universe. He's somebody who is not liked much in the West. He's not liked much in Russia. He's a controversial figure. So he's a big, easy target. Coming after him at this particular time strengthens the narrative that we're going after all kinds of people who are corrupt. And that way we can get rid of the defense minister as well. We can allege that he's somehow involved in corruption too. We don't, however, want to talk about the war.
And Alex, what do you think might be behind this? As Alexander was saying, they're using this as an opportunity to get rid of these people. Maybe there's some difficult decisions coming, and someone like Kolomoisky, other oligarchs, these are people that actually can have a rebuttal to any of these decisions. They actually have the money and the militias to change a decision that is made. So maybe they're sweeping these people out for that reason. What do you think, Alex?
Yeah, Kolomoisky's pretty nasty dude. He had a Privat Bank in Cyprus, which was operating Ukraine, but had a big presence in Cyprus as well. They're saying that he was involved in fraud and money laundering. Privat Bank in Cyprus has shut down. I walk by that bank almost daily. When
I've seen that in your videos.
It's shut down. It was a pretty suspicious. I mean, it wasn't like a normal bank where you'd see people walking in and opening up checkings accounts or savings accounts. It was pretty much the doors were covered up, and it was for individuals that I guess wanted to do other types of banking. It wasn't for the everyday people, but it's shut down. And Kolomoisky, I think that a lot of this is distraction, but this is the guy that made Zelensky. I mean, he made him servant of the people, the television show. This was Zelensky's sponsor, his puppet master, his mentor, call it whatever you want. A very interesting way to get someone elected, by the way. You create a TV show, and then you take the name of that TV show, and that's the name of the political party. And the character that Zelensky played was a teacher who then becomes president of Ukraine. Then you have a comedian actor who then becomes president of Ukraine. So it was an interesting way for Kolomoisky to, in his mind, he thought he was going to be the man behind the curtain, get Zelensky in power. Then he was going to run Ukraine. It didn't work out like that. The United States got a hold of Zelensky, and they moved Kolomoisky out. And that's where Kolomoisky was left. From what I understand, he went to Switzerland. He was living in Switzerland. I don't know why he came back to Ukraine, but I have two theories as to what's going on. Outside of the distraction that Alexander mentioned, I think there's two theories. The one theory is that Zelensky is being pressured to have elections in 2024. So just maybe Kolomoisky was up to something, or maybe saw Kolomoisky as a threat, or maybe they thought that Kolomoisky was going to pull another servant of the people trick or something like that and try to get someone elected. So maybe they wanted to take him out. It's not the first time, probably won't be the last time that Zelensky gets rid of his political opponents. He's gotten rid of a lot of political opponents. So maybe that's one of the reasons. I talked about that in a video I did as being one of the reasons. Another possibility was some viewers sent me their thoughts on Kolomoisky. And I think this is an interesting theory. It's just a theory. Perhaps arresting Kolomoisky is not so much about getting rid of him for the elections. Maybe it's about hiding him or protecting him. More hiding him because of the Burisma scandal. There are rumors that the real person behind Burisma, and I don't know, Alexander, if you've heard these rumors as well.
Absolutely.
I think these are credible rumors that the real person behind Zlochevsky and Burisma is Kolomoisky. And the timing He's kind of curious, perhaps. Kolomoisky knows certain things, and maybe the Biden White House, they said, look, this guy, for some reason, he came back to Ukraine. Maybe he was running away from something in Europe. Maybe he was worried about something. He's back in Ukraine. Let's grab this guy and make sure he doesn't talk to anybody about Burisma, because we've got a whole bunch of investigations which are unfolding in the U.S. Maybe. I'm not saying that this is what's going on. I'm just presenting two different alternative theories as to what's going on with Kolomoisky. But I think that's a possibility given the timing of things.
And then the defense minister was just let go. And he had been involved in a corruption scandal before. And they indicated that he might be on his way out then, but they said they will keep him on until the offensive is over. And I think we could all agree the offensive pretty much looks like it's over. And now he's out. I'm just wondering what can you say about this? And does this and Kolomoisky, are these linked at all to President Zelensky's visit to the U.S.?
Well, it is far from. It's quite possible that it is. I mean, the first thing to understand about Reznikov is that he was actually pretty close to Zelensky. I mean, there's attempts I've noticed in the media today, in the West, in the Guardian, for example, to distance Reznikov from Zelensky. But Reznikov historically has been close to Zelensky, and it was Kolomoisky has also been close to Zelensky, and both of them have been targets of corruption claims. I should say, but in this part of the world, it's important always to understand that when you hear that somebody is the target of a corruption claim, it's most often the case that their political adversaries are coming after them. In a place like Ukraine, I'm sorry to say this, but corruption is so widespread that it is easy to bring up corruption as a reason to come after someone. It's just an available tool. It doesn't mean that the people who are coming after you necessarily or frankly are bothered by corruption. It's just a convenient way of getting rid of someone. I think Reznikov, he's got problems with the West. There was an attempt last winter to get rid of him then, and to bring in a very much more hardline figure who is Budanov, the intelligence chief we were talking about. It seems that Zelensky didn't want to do that. Some people in the West had doubts. They were concerned about Budanov being altogether too hardline, and Reznikov stayed. And Reznikov is the person who's been going around the West, getting everybody to come up with the tanks, the Leopard 2s, the Abrams, all of those things. He clearly made all kinds of promises that a breakthrough would be achieved over the course of the offensive. The breakthrough has not been achieved. I think a lot of people are annoyed about that in the West. Some people perhaps feel that they were sold something that hasn't happened. And I think the moment has come, therefore, to look for a scapegoat, find Reznikov as the scapegoat, remove him, bring up the issue of corruption. That clears the air for Zelensky eventually to come to New York. He's no longer got Kolomoisky there as this embarrassing figure from his past hanging around. He's no longer got Reznikov as this embarrassing person from the present who promised all this about the offensive. And he's out of the way too. So you can talk about Zelensky, and of course you isolate him from his previous sponsors and make Zelensky also ultimately more dependent upon you, people in the West as well. And the interesting thing is, at least Reznikov has had some military experience. He was a member of the Soviet Armed Forces. He served in the Soviet Air Force just for 2 years. I mean, as part of his national service in the Soviet Union, but he does have that kind of background. The man who's taking over from him is a complete civilian. He's in charge of Ukraine's property fund. He's in no sense anybody who has any connection with the military at all. and which Reznikov did. The attraction of this new defense minister is that he's a Crimean Tatar. So that makes him attractive politically, ideologically, if you like, for the West. But it also, I think, by removing Reznikov from the scene, now makes it easier for Western governments to direct contact and speak directly to Ukrainian commanders without having to go through the medium of the Ukrainian Defense Ministry. It means that, in effect, the US has tightened its control still further over what goes on the battlegrounds in Ukraine.
So that really does sound like they got rid of an oligarch who had the ability to push back on decisions the West would be making for Ukraine, and now they've done this with the Ministry of Defense. Alex, how do you see all of this? How do you think this is developing, and why is this happening, and why now all at the same time?
Yeah, well, they had to scapegoat someone. I mean, the counteroffensive has been a complete disaster, a complete failure. They actually lost territory in the counteroffensive. They lost the north. So, I mean, this counteroffensive has been an absolute complete failure, and they can move the goalposts all they want. They were telling us months in advance before the counteroffensive. They were talking about the counteroffensive 3 months in advance of the June 4th date, and they were saying it is going to take 5 days. We're going to make it to the Sea of Azov. The Russian military is going to run in fear. They're going to run in fear when they see the Ukraine military. We're going to get to the Sea of Azov. We're going to start shelling Crimea. It's going to be over. Putin's going to have to capitulate. That was what they were telling everybody, and they were confident about it. Borrell was confident about it. Ursula was confident. Biden, Sullivan, Blinken, Reznikov, Zelensky, all of them, they were certain that this is what's going to happen. And we're 3 months into this, and Ukraine has lost territory. And for Ukraine, territory is the most important. That's what matters to Ukraine. That's what matters for the narrative. It's territory. That's what they're absolutely concerned about. Not soldiers, not men, not resources, equipment. They want territory, because that can translate into the media narrative that Ukraine is pushing Russia back and they're regaining the land that Russia occupies. It makes a nice media narrative, and it's easy for people to understand when they read the headlines. But they've accomplished none of this. And Reznikov, in an interview that he gave before he was canned, he said that the U.S. has. He said the collective West, they've given Ukraine $100 billion in military aid. $60 billion of that is coming from the United States. And what do they have to show for it? Nothing. They have nothing to show for it. This has been the worst investment. If you look at it from the U.S. side of things, you can't get a much worse investment than what's happened. So, someone had to go. Someone had to go. You can't get rid of Zaluzhny. No one even knows if Zaluzhny is really Zaluzhny. No one knows. No one knows if Budanov is Budanov. So you have to get rid of Reznikov. I think he's an easy target. He's easy to get rid of. He's the Minister of Defense. Zelensky says that he has to get rid of Reznikov so they can come up with new ideas and new strategies, whatever. He's the guy that was on the chopping block. I think he was the easy target. I've heard rumors that he could be going to the UK as ambassador to the UK. Perhaps that'll be his exit. If I'm Reznikov, I would actually be relieved. I would be relieved. The guy can now take off, and he's out of this thing. This is another sign, another indication. This, along with all the mobilization that's taking place, the wheels are coming off. The wheels are coming off of this thing. And maybe it's coming off a lot quicker than I think the neocons are hoping for, because we've been saying on the Duran for a while now that the ultimate goal of Sullivan and much of Biden's election team is to try and get this conflict to make it to November 2024. It's not far away, just about a year and a couple of months away. So that's what Sullivan and his team are saying. We only have a year and 2 months. Let's just figure out a way to get this conflict past November 2024. but the wheels are coming off very, very quickly.
So scapegoat. I think I agree with that, but I also agree with Alexander that the U.S. or the West in general are trying to tighten control over Ukraine. So I would just like to ask you, Alexander, what do you think the decisions are that the U.S. wants to make, that they worried about maybe some pushback, or they want to streamline things to make it easier to make these decisions? What decisions do you, and this is all speculation, but what do you think is behind that?
Well, first of all, I don't think it's complete speculation. I mean, there was this meeting about 2 weeks ago now between Milley and Zaluzhny, who's the chief of the Ukrainian military. He's a military officer, which apparently happened in Lvov, and there were all kinds of officials on both sides. There was a British admiral, and there was the commander, the ground forces commander of NATO there. And for me, the most extraordinary thing that came out of that meeting, of course, we don't have transcripts or readouts, but there's lots of media disclosures about this meeting, is that essentially Milley was telling Zaluzhny what you should do. He said, forget about the north. Don't worry about the fact that the Russians are advancing in the north. Don't worry about that. Don't worry about what's going on around Bakhmut either. That's, we're not interested in that. You've got to concentrate all your forces attacking in the south. And that's what we want you to do. And that's what you are going to do. And Zaluzhny tried to push back and say, well, this isn't going to work. We're going to lose territory here. We're going to lose ground there. Our, defenses are going to start crumbling. And apparently Milley and the Americans and the British were utterly implacable. They didn't want to listen. They made it very clear what the strategy Ukraine should follow, the military strategy Ukraine should follow should be. And Zaluzhny had no choice but to comply. And, just consider, this is supposed to be a war for Ukraine's survival as an independent state. And we see that it doesn't have the ability, which every independent state would consider, I think, fundamental, to decide how it defends itself. It's having to take orders from the military commanders of foreign countries, from the United States and Britain. So why does the United States, why do Britain want to focus everything on the Zaporozhye front? And I think it's not actually that complicated. If we come back to the point that Alex was making, that they want to somehow either spin this out until the election itself, or if things get really difficult, try to force some kind of a ceasefire deal on the Russians, which the Russians will agree to. Now, they don't want to just, say to the Russians, we're going to talk about the kind of things you care about, demilitarization in Ukraine, the change in the political situation in Ukraine, the security situation in Europe, Ukraine's position outside NATO as a neutral country. They don't want to talk about that. They want to talk about just freezing the front lines so that they can get a situation where they can hold on to what is left of Ukraine. They can sell that in the United States as a success. They won't compromise on Ukraine's NATO membership, whether or not that is any longer still on the agenda. And they've decided that they're not going to achieve that through any other means other than by breaking through to the Sea of Azov and, as they think, putting pressure on the Russians in Crimea. They've decided that for the Russians, Crimea is so important that if you can put the pressure on the Russians that way, you can force them to talk. Now, whether they're right about any of that is a completely different matter, but I think that is what it's all about now. It's about trying to limit the damage ahead of the election next year, and also ahead of the very likely impeachment inquiry, which is now likely to happen in the United States, which inevitably, if it's pursued with even a minimal amount of vigor, is going to bring out more issues about the president's long-term relationship with Ukraine.
And then Alex, if you agree with this, and that it does seem like that's what's going on, why would Russia agree to any sort of ceasefire, especially when they know that the U.S., their allies, are just going to use this as an opportunity to, again, buy time, remilitarize, build Ukrainian military back up, and go through all of this all over again, especially when we see that Russia is making progress in the north, specifically because Ukraine's military is so overstretched, and what's left of it is being wiped out in the south. Why would they agree to this? Because even if Ukraine made it to the Sea of Azov, what would they have left to hold it? Why wouldn't Russia be able to overturn that, just like they're overturning gains made by Ukraine last fall in Kharkov?
Yeah, I mean, you talk about this all the time on your videos as well, Brian. I mean, even if Ukraine would have, I mean, I think now to talk about getting to the Sea of Azov is, okay, that's not going to happen. The Ukraine will be lucky to capture Rabotinya in the next 3 weeks. But even if they would have made it to the Sea of Azov, you talk about it often. You know, how would they be able to hold on to it? And Russia has many other ways to get logistics, to work the logistic lines in the south. So I mean, you know, this is the whole Crimea thing has been a fixation not for Russia. It's been a fixation of the collective West for 10 years now, 15 years. I mean, they're absolutely fixated on Russia. I believe the UK on Crimea. I believe the UK is fixated on Crimea. Maybe it goes back 100 years. I'm not exaggerating here. I think there's something in the mind of the UK elites which is just absolutely focused on Crimea. This seems to be this 100-year, 150-year grudge that they have against Russia. As far as the United States, I think it's the neocons. I think you have to look at Newland and people like this who are absolutely fixated on Crimea. I think they feel that when they had the coup in Maidan in 2014, they feel that Putin pulled a fast one on them. That's what Newland is probably thinking, because her ultimate goal in the Maidan coup, the Obama White House's ultimate goal in the coup in Maidan, was to get Crimea. And that's what they were working towards. And then all of a sudden, within one night, Putin consolidated control on Crimea. The people voted. They wanted to ascend into the Russian Federation, and that was that. So I think there's this neocon belief that Putin snatched Crimea from their hands, and they're fixated on it. So, you know, in their minds, they probably think that if they can threaten Crimea, they can press Russia to some sort of ceasefire. But that ceasefire would have just been another way for them to rearm and then to continue and try to push towards some sort of conquering of Crimea. I mean, they all say it. Zelensky, Budanov, they all talk about fishing in Crimea and swimming in Crimea and having their summer holidays in Crimea. Everything is about Crimea for them. And it's not going to happen. They have not been able to get to the acceptance stage of grief and mourning. Just accept the fact Crimea is Russia. They can't accept it. No. They simply cannot accept it. And what they're doing is they're destroying all of Ukraine, all of the Ukraine military, so that they can somehow make this fantasy that they have in their heads come true. It's not going to happen. But keep on sending troops and military, not just keep on more and more troops in that direction. Just keep on going. It's not happening, but they just can't accept it.
Well, can I just make a further point to add to Alex's? I mean, the new Ukrainian defense minister is a Crimean Tatar. So almost by definition, he is being appointed in order to reinforce that obsessive focus on Crimea. I mean, you know, forget about Kharkiv. We don't really care about Kharkiv. We don't really care about Bakhmut. After all of this, about Donbass and all the rest, the fixation always remains on Crimea. It's the one the West has. They're convinced that this is, you know, the place where they're going to achieve the decisive outcome. And of course, there's also this obsession within Ukraine itself, to some extent at least. But anyway, it's been promoted there. So the new defense minister has been selected, and he will have been selected after consultation with Washington and London, in part because as a Crimean Tatar, he is somebody who they're confident is going to support this overriding fixation with Crimea. And, you know, what goes on in Kupiansk and what goes on in Bakhmut really doesn't interest them.
And what's astounding is all of the flawed assumptions that they made that led them to believe that the offensive would be much more successful than it has been. That's what all of this other this vision is based on, and they see the offensive failing catastrophically, but they're not going to adjust these assumptions that they're basing all of this strategy or this process that they're working on. And we're talking about them trying to buy more time or to drag this conflict out longer. And I don't know if you saw this from the Financial Times. Ukraine cannot win against Russia now, but victory by 2025 is possible. And this is why I actually, the main reason I wanted to have you both on was to talk about military industrial output. It says allies must ramp up weapons production to give Kiev the means to overpower Moscow once and for all. And then further down in the article, it says the war turns on the defense industrial capacity of the West, and Ukraine as a determining factor in military success. More could be provided from stocks, but Ukraine's campaign now relies on allies ramping up their defense industries. Ammunition from newly expanded production lines will take until at least mid-2024 to arrive in quantity. This should enable a major turning point in Kiev's offensive capability. And we've all talked about what they mean by this 155 millimeter artillery shells. I've seen everything from 2025 at the earliest to as late as 2028. And even when they expand production, it'll only be half of what Ukraine is firing right now, which is still inadequate to match what Russia is capable of doing. So maybe we could start talking a little bit about this idea that in 2 or 3 years, things will be better for the West in terms of military industrial output. Who wants to start and where?
I'm just going to say 6 more months to flatten the curve, right? And another year to flatten the curve. That's, I mean, you know, all right, 2025, then they're going to say 2027, then they'll say 2029. This is nonsense. You know, I'm very curious as to what both of you think. All of a sudden, we're seeing a lot of stories come out in the last 2 weeks about how Ukraine is going to be the Silicon Valley of military production. All of a sudden, Ukraine is going to be building factories for Germany, for Sweden, for Norway, for BAE Systems in the UK. All of a sudden, Ukraine is going to be this big military manufacturing powerhouse. I mean, what is causing all of this? Because obviously, anyone with half a brain understands that Ukraine is not going to be manufacturing weapons on the territory of Ukraine. Russia's not going to allow that. And we don't even know if there's going to be a Ukraine in a year from now to manufacture weapons. So something is going on here, because there's constant talk about Ukraine manufacturing all kinds of weapons, from tanks to ammunition to missiles to cardboard drones. I was reading CNN. They had an article saying that Ukraine is now one of the big manufacturers of fake drones, of decoy drones. There's some angle here. I still haven't been able to quite figure it out just yet, but all these articles, one after another, talking about how Ukraine's going to be manufacturing all these weapons is kind of interesting.
It's fascinating. I'm going to offer my own tuppence on this, because, of course, I can't. We don't know, but my own guess is that a lot of this is coming from the military-industrial complex in the United States and in Europe. They know perfectly well that they're not going to be able to ramp up military production to the kind of levels that the author of that article was talking about. By the way, I found that a deeply depressing article altogether. I mean, it was talking about some kind of a victory. It was talking about fighting on to 2025 and beyond. Its entire focus is on victory, achieving victory. And of course, its perspective ultimately was a purely Western one, not a Ukrainian one. I mean, he actually mentions in the body of that article that it's important for Ukraine to win in order to secure the future of NATO. So, I mean, it's no longer about Ukrainian independence. It's about NATO. So Ukraine has to sacrifice itself, on the altar of preserving NATO. But put that aside, they know perfectly well, the MIC knows perfectly well that they're not going to be able to build up production to the levels that, people are saying. A couple of months ago, I read in the Financial Times that the US had doubled shell production to 30,000 rounds of 155 millimeter shells a month. And then it turned out that wasn't true. It was actually 24,000 rounds. Okay, it's an increase, but still they're not achieving the increases that they were talking about. So what do? You can't achieve this enormous increase in production. We're seeing no sign of this big increase in production that people are talking about. So what do? You come under all this pressure from the politicians and you say, well, look, we can't achieve this today, but don't worry. Eventually, we will be opening all these factories in Ukraine and we will be able to do it there. So it's a way for the MIC to take some of the political heat off them and at the same time to reassure the politicians that they're doing everything they can and, of course, to keep the money flowing in their direction. So I think that's what this is all about. This is my own guess.
Absolutely. And I saw someone in the comment section reminded me of what I've said about this previously. It's like if you're in a fist fight and you're losing, so you start trying to work out in the middle of the fist fight to get stronger to win the fist fight. It's impossible. It cannot happen. And, maybe let's talk about the prerequisites for building multiple factories like this. You need to have the human resources, which means you need to have the education system to support creating the human resources you need to man these factories. And security, obviously, is a huge factor. As you both pointed out, how can you build a factory inside Ukraine at this point? I think it was Arestovich, the first couple of months of the special military operation, admitting that Ukraine's military industrial complex was obliterated. It does not exist. So how are they going to build a factory in the middle of a war? So it is, even if they could and there was somehow a way to ensure security, do they have the resources to do this, the human resources to do this? And I think the answer is no, because if you could build these factories at all anywhere, they would be built in the West, wouldn't they? But they cannot. So that's kind of what I want to get into. I was talking with Alexander behind the scenes about this. This is from the Brookings Institution, and it's a global manufacturing scorecard. This is from 2018, but I think we'll still get the point here. And it's talking about, nations and their manufacturing capabilities. And when you look at it, okay, you see China all the way at the top, and then you see the United States as number 2. But if you look closely, this is all measured in value, not actual industrial output. So, Alexander, you made a series of very good points about this and the whole way manufacturing is perceived in the West versus actual manufacturing and the physical output of goods, especially military goods. Maybe you could go over some of those.
Yeah, the fundamental problem with this whole study, and I've said this already, is that it was actually very, very difficult to work out its methodology. But its basic point about this study was that it was trying very much to give the impression that the United States retains its enormous manufacturing prowess. So its output, according to this article, is almost matches China. That was, of course, written in 2018. But then it talks not about actual volume. So you're not talking about, the number of trucks built, the number of ships built, the number of machine tools built, where China, by the way, dwarfs the United States. Steel output, and, we have had some recent numbers for steel output. And I just am going to cite them because, as it happens, I was looking at steel output figures last month for completely unrelated reasons, not even connected, by the way, to the work we're doing on our various programs. But production of steel was 6.7 million metric tons per month in July in the United States. In Russia, it was 6.4 million metric tons, almost slightly less than in the United States. Japan was more, around 11 million metric tons. This is in 1 month. China was 90 million metric tons. That already begins to give you a sense of the sheer scale of difference. And of course, there are other problems with this particular study, and I'm going to identify two. Firstly, they don't look at the actual rivals. They do case studies, but they don't look at the US's actual rivals. The country that they talk about as having a superb manufacturing skills and industries almost up to the level of the United States is the United Kingdom, Britain, which would astonish you if you lived there. This is not what people think in Britain at all. Here, in fact, manufacturing productivity has been stagnating for decades. And we are in no sense any longer the kind of workshop that this study looks at. But the study doesn't look at China, it doesn't look at Russia, it doesn't look at Japan, it doesn't look at Germany, it doesn't look at South Korea. It compares the United States with countries like Mexico and Indonesia and Brazil and all those places, which of course already make it seem as if the United States is a more impressive manufacturing competitor than the others. And last but not least, it does give away something which is very interesting, which is numbers of people employed in manufacturing. And these are 2018 numbers, by the way. So they're probably not accurate as to today. But the United States has 16 million people working in manufacturing. Now, of course, what is manufacturing is, it can change. You can come up with different numbers for that, but 16 million people is what this study says. Russia, by the way, is around 10 million. Russia has half the population of the United States, less than half the population of the United States. We can already see that a much higher proportion of the population is involved in manufacturing in Russia than it is in the United States. China, according to this same study, has 128 million people involved in manufacturing. More than 10 times what the United States has. Now, you've been to China, you will find that it's a well-organized, many respects, very modern country. It's got some very advanced plant. Are we really going to be told, were we really being asked to believe that the United States and China are almost equal at levels in manufacturing, that American workers, in other words, are 10 times more productive than Chinese workers are? I mean, ask people at Apple if that's the case. Ask people in so many industries in the United States if that is really the case. If productivity in the United States is so much higher than in China, why has the United States been running these huge deficits with China in terms of manufactured and industrial goods? So this is another example of these surveys that we constantly get that give a completely distorted picture of industrial and economic realities. And I mentioned to Brian that for many years, about 20 years, the World Bank actually did a survey which is based on a much more transparent methodology, much more detailed methodology than this one is, and which also relied a lot on actual data provided through investigations of particular countries. And this was the World Bank's Ease of Doing Business survey. I used to follow this very carefully. And then what happened was that Russia, which was very low down in this survey about 15 years ago, started to creep upwards. And then shortly before the pandemic began, it had drawn level with some of the West European countries that were, aligned with the United States. It was ahead of France, for example. And it became known that the United States was very unhappy with this survey, and there were more and more criticisms of it in the media. And so during the pandemic, the excuse was found to do away with it entirely. So the world, the ease of business doing survey, which, was showing problems, and, you don't talk about that anymore. You come up with so-called surveys like this with very untransparent and subjective methodologies based on values, which, can be different in one country or another. You don't look at actual output figures. You make all kinds of presumptions. You don't actually make comparisons with your true comparators, and you get the results that this survey comes up with.
And go
ahead,
Brian, Alexander. Ask German automakers about China manufacturing. Yeah.
I want to throw one more stat in there. STEM graduates by country. So China, 4.7 million every year. The United States, 568,000. Russia, 561,000. Just as you pointed out, Alexander, they have a smaller population and yet a comparable number of STEM graduates. So this is like when they talk about GDP or the U.S. military budget, how massive it is. How could Russia ever dream of competing with the U.S. because of its military budget or its GDP? But when so much of that is tied up with corruption or creative accounting, and when you actually look at the capabilities on the battlefield, and you see that Russia is equal or greater in many areas, this seems very similar to that. So if that is the case with manufacturing, and they're admitting that this is coming down to manufacturing, what is going to happen by 2025 or 2027 if this conflict is still taking place? And then you could answer that, and then how do they figure they're going to then pivot from proxy war with Russia to proxy war or direct war with China?
Indeed. Before we move on to that, Alex, because you've just recently experienced Chinese cars. I mean, you were talking about them. I mean, perhaps you can tell Brian
you've got the numbers
a bit about Chinese cars that you can.
But I was telling you that in Moscow, St. Petersburg, where I was, I would say that 50% of the cars are now Chinese cars, and they're all good. I mean, what can you say? Some of them are very very high end, like very luxurious cars. They have the cars for the taxi services, for the Yandex taxis. 50% of all the automobiles now that I saw in Moscow. Maybe I'm exaggerating it a bit. Maybe it's more like 40%, but all kinds of Chinese cars that I've never seen in my life. I had no idea what these cars were, who made them, but you order up a taxi, you get in one of these cars, and they look pretty cool from the inside out. I mean, I've seen the charts of Chinese auto manufacturing. I mean, it has overtaken German auto manufacturing. Is that correct?
Absolutely. And can I just say, because I have connections with Germany, the Germans are spooked by all of this. The Chinese are well ahead of the Germans now in absolute volume of manufacturing, and is growing. And of course, if you're talking about sort of high-end manufacturing, the Chinese do produce now very high-end cars, very, very high levels of quality control, and very high levels of productivity. So there it is. The Germans are getting nervous. And of course, Germany is, alongside Japan, the two countries that in the West, in the Western alliance system, they're the two best manufacturing producers in cars. So there we are.
And I just want to point out here in Thailand, because in Russia, you could explain that by saying, well, Europe put the sanctions on Russia, and this is one of the ways it's backfiring. But even here in Thailand, where there are no sanctions and people are free to buy whatever they want, you still see Chinese cars getting a very, very big foothold in a very, very short amount of time. And this was something else you were talking about, Alexander, when we were discussing this. Aircraft manufacturing, Boeing and Airbus with this duopoly. Russia and China are now manufacturing commercial airliners. And look at what's happening in Russia with car manufacturing. The sanctions backfired in Europe's face, and now Russia is buying Chinese cars. Think about if this continues, and think about how big the market is in China for just domestic flights. How is that going to work out if Airbus and Boeing find themselves excluded from that market and Chinese and Russian manufacturers fill the void?
Absolutely. Now, this is actually a very important point, because the thing to always understand is that if we're looking back to the time when that survey was made, which is in 2018, we talked about the fact that value, that they're using they're not actually looking at volumes, they're looking at value of manufacturing, which is always, in some respects, a subjective figure, because value depends very much on, local conditions, supply and demand, but also, and one has to be straightforward about this, the way in which, funding works. But one of the major high value items which the United States produces, and which until very few years ago, until almost now, the US and Europe basically had a monopoly of, was aircraft construction. I mean, if you sell a wide-bodied jet, that is a very high value, very expensive item. You might not produce vast numbers of them, but the point is that those that you do produce cost an awful lot, and that will inevitably make the value of your output look high. Now, the United States and Europe, Boeing and Airbus, operated a duopoly. There were no competitors. Anywhere in the world, if you wanted wide body or even narrow bodied aircraft to any extent, you had to go to Boeing and Airbus. And in every system where there is a duopoly or even a monopoly, prices are going to be set high because there is limited competition. China is now starting aircraft production in a big way. They've just produced their first narrow-bodied aircraft, and they got big plans to move on to wide-bodied aircraft. Russia is doing the same. The sanctions now mean that the Russians are giving more emphasis to their own domestic aircraft manufacturing. The Soviet Union had a big internal market for aircraft. It used to produce aircraft largely for that one internal market, but they're now reviving that. So they're not going to be buying Boeing and Airbus anymore. They can't. So we're going to get the Tupolev and the MS-21s appearing in Russia. And of course, China dwarfs that. I mean, it's going to be colossal. And with the scale of production in China, we get also the economies of scale. Alex was talking about how Chinese cars are up to the level of German or Japanese cars. There's no reason to think it's going to be anything different with aircraft, wide-bodied aircraft. And the Russians and the Chinese are working together on engines, on all kinds of things of this kind. Potentially, with this huge domestic market to draw upon, they're going to have economies of scale that the United States and Europe simply cannot match. And the Boeing Airbus duopoly, which has been already looking quite ragged. I mean, we've had all the problems with the Boeing 737 program, for example, that's going to be in severe difficulty over the next, Boeing is going to be in severe difficulty probably over the next 10 years. And Airbus, quite frankly, is hanging on by its fingernails. At least that's my own impression.
And I just want to throw in one more thing, smartphones. Remember how Huawei was gaining on, say, Apple. And so the US resorted to all of these tricks to exclude Huawei products around the globe, in the US, around the globe, all these ways to try to sabotage the company. But then Xiaomi came along and eventually surpassed Apple. So this seems like something inevitable. So I go back to my question. If this is the reality of manufacturing, where Russia is not nearly as inferior as they try to portray, and China is clearly surpassing the collective West, not just the US, but the collective West, where does this leave US proxy war in Europe, in Ukraine, or say in the Pacific? Where does that leave it if they are physically incapable of producing the materiel needed to not just sustain a conflict, but to actually also win it? Maybe
Well,
Alex, maybe.
Yeah, Alex.
Okay.
Alexander, you want? Yeah.
Well, let me come to a comparison, because ultimately, if you're talking about war, conflict, it all ultimately comes down to manufacturing, the ability to maintain and sustain over time very high volumes of production. Now, we actually have a good analogy, a good parallel here, which is with the position of the United States and of the British Empire on the eve of the Second World War. Now, on the eve of the Second World War, the British Empire and the United States had GDPs which were very close to each other. But of course, the reality was that the United States in the 1930s and 40s was a manufacturing colossus, which the British Empire was not. Britain specifically was not a manufacturing colossus. Britain could not have sustained the Second World War, its role in the Second World War, without manufacturing, the support from the manufacturing of the United States. And that became very clear very fast. Already by 1940, the British were coming to the Americans asking for weapons, for fighter jets, for destroyers, for all kinds of machines, because they could not sustain the war on the basis of the manufacturing they had themselves. German industrial production was much greater than Britain's, and Britain had a bigger GDP than Germany, but he couldn't compete in that field with Germany. And of course, it was dwarfed by what the United States could do. So you can't sustain wars, you can't sustain conflicts without the industrial manufacturing skills that go behind it, and also the technical skills. You talked about STEM graduates, the fact that the Russians produce almost as many STEM graduates as the US does, and China dwarfs that number. But it isn't just STEM graduates, it's also skilled workers. Now, I was looking again at Shell production figures, and I spoke to people who worked in factories in Eastern Europe, by the way, in Hungary, who were involved in manufacturing shells as part of the Warsaw Pact. And they needed to have an understanding of how shells were made. They needed to understand how explosives worked, how metals worked, because otherwise, if you put in the wrong explosive into a shell casing, it could be extremely dangerous. And this needed a lot of industrial skills. In Russia, that exists. In China, obviously it exists. In the United States, it doesn't exist to anything like that scale anymore.
Absolutely. Alex, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just going to add that everything that you guys are saying is correct. But the problem that we have with the neocons, the EU globalists, is that they don't think like this. No. They're not going to think, we're not going to be able to go, we're not going to be able to continue the war with Russia because we can't manufacture at their level. Or we're not going to be able to go at war with China because we can't compete with them. They don't think like this. No. To them, it's, we can do it, but we don't have the manufacturing. Don't worry about it. We'll figure it out. Yeah. We'll beat them because we have a better ideology. Right, we're better. We're a democracy, or we're the neocons, or we're the European. We have EU values, so we'll win in the end. They're not thinking on these levels, which for me, the West, especially like the United States, their greatest strength is the fact that they're so good with the media. Yeah. But it's also their greatest weakness, because they buy into their media narratives and their spin. You know, Russia is a gas station masquerading as a country. You know, the Chinese economy is crumbling. You know, Russia's running out of weapons. Russia's running out of weapons. Russia's running out of weapons. Believe me, Russia's running out of weapons. But they buy into these narratives. They're so good at the information control. They're so good at creating the spin. Good for them. The marketing is fantastic, but it also traps them. And when you put the neocons into the mix, and you put the EU kleptocrats into the mix, for them, it's, we can defeat China, we can defeat Russia, we can defeat both of them at the same time. But what about logistics? What about manufacturing? What about STEM? What are you talking about? They're going to say, what do you do? This stuff is meaningless. That has nothing to do with the conflict that we're going to engage with Russia, because Russia can't win because it's a gasoline station masquerading as a country. And if we place, a couple of sanctions on them, the Putin government's going to collapse. The people are going to get out in the street. Once we cancel the flights from Russia to Europe, the Russian citizens are going to be furious because they won't be able to vacation in Greece, and they won't be able to go to Paris. They're going to get onto the streets in Moscow. They're going to demand that Putin resign, and it's going to be over. That was their thinking. They're not thinking on your guys' level. They're not thinking manufacturing and 155 millimeter ammo, and that doesn't even cross their mind. You know, for them, why is there food in the supermarket? Because there is. Well, how did it get there? I don't know. It's there. Be there tomorrow. That's the problem with it all.
Absolutely. I think it really is ideology, and it has taken over common sense and reason. And what they'll say is, we'll just like in that Financial Times article, we'll just expand it. We'll just make more, but they don't understand the prerequisites and the fact that will take time, that will take years to do. And I think it was your video today, Alexander, or today or yesterday, you were talking about, I forget who it was admitting it, but it was either a Ukrainian or someone in the West admitting that not only does Russia, they're not running out of weapons, but they're getting newer and newer weapons and more of them, right, including who was that?
I think it was this. I can never remember his name exactly. Jan Ripke. Somebody. I think he was writing for Bild Zeitung. He was saying that the fundamental problem is that the Russians are now churning out more modern tanks. And, we're starting to see more and more of these tanks appear on the scene. Who would have thought about that? I mean, they're not relying on T-62s anymore. They're actually producing T-90Ms and T-70, modernized T-72s. And this is now starting to change the balance on the battlefields. So, but Alex has made exactly the right point. That Financial Times article, by the way, is a classic example of this, and written notice by a military officer, by a former military officer. But he isn't interested in how. He doesn't go into the detail of how you're supposed to start up all this production. I mean, how many new factories must you open? How many workers need to be trained? What steps do you need to train those workers? How long does it take? What amount of funds do you need to allocate for that? Industrial planning. None of that really enters into it. What he just seems to imagine is that you press a button, and then in a few months' time, the weapons will simply appear. And they'll start to appear on the scene in mid-2024, and then you'll go on and you'll win in 2025. But he's not really interested. He doesn't really look at the question of how you get from where we are now to that point where he wants to be, or whether that's even achievable at all. And can I just say, I read these awful neocon journals, which there are so many of them in the United States, all the time. And that is the major gap. They take the ability of the West to just produce things, to do all of these things, for granted. It's never a question of how. It's a question of simply exercise the will. If you have the will to do this by itself, that's enough. That's going to produce the weapons. You don't have to sit down and plan it and work out how it's done. And of course, in this article, he's talking about mobilizing the Western economy for war, which is, again, an astonishing thing. He doesn't seem to understand what that would mean, what the effect on Western society of doing something like that would be, what the inflationary consequences of trying to do anything like that would be, the fact that you would need entirely different organizational and planning and economic structures. None of that, of course, bothers him.
Alex, did you want to say something?
No, I think, you know, the point that Alexander is making is reflected in the sanctions. It's reflected in the cutting off of Russian gas. It's reflected in the oil price cap. They make these moves, but they don't plan. They don't think. They just say we're going to cut Russian gas, but they didn't plan out what they're going to do next. No. You know, and they were scrambling. And now the truth is coming out that, you know, Germany got through last winter because, well, they were subsidizing. They were actually paying businesses to pay the high bills. They're buying. There's an increase of 40% in Russian LNG to the EU. Mm. You know, the price caps. They said they're gonna put a price cap on Russian oil. That collapsed. No one's talking about that anymore. So I mean, you know, they cover over these things and they don't think about the moves that they make, because in their mind, you know, Russia's just going to collapse. Don't worry about it. Well, what if Russia doesn't collapse? Don't worry about it. It's going to collapse, and then we're going to get the gas on the cheap. But it didn't collapse. And then they're sitting there and they're trying to patch things up, and they barely made it through last winter. This winter is not going to be that easy. If it's a very hard winter, it's going to be very difficult for Europe. And the German government has already said that they don't have the money to subsidize. And inflation now has kind of already been accepted. Yeah. For some reason, people have accepted the inflation. But why? Why did we get the inflation? Because these knuckleheads thought that they could sanction Russia into oblivion, and they never thought what the blowback would be. They didn't plan for it. That's, you know, everything Alexander is saying is reflected in the moves that they actually make. You can see the way they think, which is they're not thinking at all. They're not thinking at all. They're just doing stuff, and they think everything's going to magically just work out. Why? Because we have EU values. That's why. EU values are going to carry us through. And no one even knows what those EU values are, but they're going to carry us through.
And I've noticed analysts, Western analysts like Michael Kaufman, I cite him often. I've followed his analysis from the beginning of the special military operation, and it does seem like he genuinely just didn't understand these things. And now that he's starting to get a grasp on it, he's starting to change his mind about his, you know, the ultimate conclusions that he was drawing. And I just wonder, is there going to be a moment of realization where they understand they're not going to win this? This is going to be a disaster. If they pivot toward China, it'll be an even bigger disaster, and that they have to stop, and they have to make this decision. I think we've talked about this before. They have to make a decision about whether they're going to work with the rest of the world or they're going to continue irrationally trying to impose themselves on the rest of the world. Do you think that moment will come, or do you think it'll have to be at the hands of BRICS and future developments forcing them to do it?
I think, to answer the question briefly, I'm afraid it'll be events that will dictate this, because we're dealing with such a massively constructed ideological and mental world that getting these people to accept the reality until it unfortunately hits them on the nose isn't going to happen. Just to illustrate a point which Alex was making about, you know, these people, you know, they really don't want to listen, and they didn't want to hear. Last year, even as Germany was taking all those decisions with Russian gas and with Russian energy that Alex was talking about, people from German industry, and Germany has a lot of industry, and there's a lot of people in Germany who do understand these things. They were coming to the economics minister, Robert Habeck, And they were saying, well, hold on a moment. If you do this, you do understand that the effect will be that, and this might not be good for us. We might be able to patch up something now, but long term, it's going to be a problem. And apparently, Robert Habeck's response always, whenever he was hearing these kind of comments, was, those are Putin talking points. And that was enough, apparently, as far as he was concerned, to shut down the whole discussion. And apparently, there was a lot of people, including, civil servants within the German economics ministries and other ministries. Germany has very good civil servants who understand these things, who are becoming incredibly frustrated. But of course, they couldn't get Habeck to change his views. Nothing will. I mean, even an economic crisis in Germany probably won't. The people who are invested in these ideas, I don't think they will ever change them. If we get an economic crisis, the way out will not be that these people will come to some kind of sudden realization that this isn't working. It will come because other people, the majority of people, people outside this closed hermetic circle will see that, and they will not only demand a change, but they will finally demand a change carried out by other people. We're very far from that point. I'm afraid there's going to be lots of trouble along the way before we get there. But eventually, it has to happen.
Yes. Alex, do you think that, based on everything Alexander said, do you think that at least at a minimum, there will be some people in the military, in the US, in the European Union that'll say, look, this is going to be a disaster. We should back off. We should not escalate. We should not end up in a war directly with Russia or with China. Do you think that at least that is a possibility, or do you think that it's just a runaway train?
Well, I think it's a possibility, absolutely. But I think that more than likely, other issues are going to overtake, say, the ramp up to conflict with Ukraine. I mean, I can very, very easily see the election in the United States and all the issues in and around Trump, Biden, and Burisma. I could see that maybe derailing the emphasis on Ukraine. For example, you had the horrific events in Hawaii, a real tragedy, a lot of suffering, a lot of death, and people still don't understand what exactly happened. But one thing that a lot of people realized is that the Biden White House doesn't care about the American people. And as all of this destruction and suffering was happening in Maui, the Biden White House was concerned with getting more money to Ukraine. I mean, I think this did have a real tangible effect on a large part of American society. Is it changing? Is it going to change the trajectory of the escalation in Ukraine? Probably not. But you do get certain things that happen which can hopefully can stop this runaway train towards conflict between Russia and the United States, or the United States and China. So, I mean, I think there are other circumstances that may derail this escalation. But who knows? These people want war. They want the war. They're fixated on it, and I think that Russia and China are ready for this war. I think they're not. They don't quite understand what they're getting into, but I think Russia and China definitely understands what's about to come. I don't think anyone wants it, though. I don't think Russia wants it. I don't think China wants it. I know the U.S. population doesn't want it, but this leadership class is, as we've been saying through half the episode, they're not in reality. They're living somewhere else, but they're not with us.
Absolutely. And maybe they think because the US was so economically and militarily powerful that they have a window of opportunity to do this before Russia and China are ready, like you say, Alex. But I think they already are ready. I think they've already in many ways surpassed the US. I think this conflict in Ukraine is a demonstration of that. So we're almost at an hour and a half. I just wanted to touch on two more subjects. I know they're kind of big to fit them in a short time, but you go as long as you want on it. Niger, will there be an intervention, ECOWAS intervention? And what is the possibility of France at least committing air power to back forces on the ground, similar to what NATO did in Libya?
Well, France is very keen on an ECOWAS intervention. When we talk about France, I should make it clear, we're talking about President Macron and Macron's government. By the way, if you've been watching Alex's programs, he's done a very good comment about this and about the way that Macron himself, I mean, he's becoming more and more delusional and more extreme in his language about this. He's now talking about, countries like Burkina Faso and Niger and all the others. They wouldn't even exist, apparently, if it were not for France. I mean, it's unbelievably patronizing and, dare I say, megalomaniac, the way that he is talking about this. I'm starting to get the sense that if there really was going to be an ECOWAS intervention, it would have happened by now. There seems to be so much uncertainty and doubt within ECOWAS itself about the wisdom of this. And I think that probably the longer the time before it happens, the less likely it will be that it will in fact happen. We're now some weeks now into this coup in Niger. The coup government is still in power. In fact, it seems to be consolidating its position. It's getting a lot of support from the people of Niger. And the other thing that's coming out very clearly is that the coup wasn't just popular in Niger. It's now making people think elsewhere in, former French colonial Africa. We've seen another coup in Gabon. There's a lot of speculation that the coups in some of these countries, actually, that the US might have had a hand in them. These are carried out by American-trained officers who are, hostile to France, sympathetic to the United States, and that it was one part of the US government trying to push the French aside. I mean, there's lots of rumors as well. But whatever the original reason behind the coups, it does seem that they are playing into a general sentiment in West and Central Africa. They want to see the back of France. They want these countries to become independent. They want a genuine independence from France. They want to see the end of the post-colonial system in Africa, which has held Africa down. And there does seem to be a genuine impetus for this. And France itself is very nervous about intervening. It's very nervous about intervening without the United States. The United States is distracted by lots of different things. And ECOWAS itself, some people within ECOWAS, are perhaps themselves partly drawn by these sentiments, that this is the moment when Africa can finally break away, assert itself, become truly independent, and become what some people have been talking about for a long time, the latest place where the world economy begins to accelerate. There's an awful lot of potential development in Africa. So much of it remains poor. There's young people, lots of them becoming quite educated. They could join the workforce. They could build up the African economies. They've been held back until this point. Maybe this is the moment when they can finally break free and use that freedom to their own advantage. So anyway, it's an interesting point. I can't definitely say we're not going to get an intervention, but with every day that passes and it doesn't happen, the danger of it recedes.
I'm worried that the reason it hasn't happened yet is because there's a lot that they have to prepare, because they're not they're not really capable of doing this. Both ECOWAS, their militaries, and France, they're not really ready for this. But I will agree that if they're not able to do this, and they want to, they want an intervention one way or the other, they want to reassert themselves. If they're unable to, if AFRICOM, US AFRICOM, is unable to do this, is this an indicator, and I throw this to you, Alex, is this an indicator, along with the rise of BRICS, the sanctions on Russia serving as motivation for all of these nations to pivot away, fearing that they could be next, and investing in BRICS? Are these indicators that things actually are changing and that time is running out? Not just in terms of they're running out of weapons and ammunition in Ukraine, but overall globally, multipolarism is on the rise and unipolarism is bottoming out.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's inevitable now. I mean, I think multipolarism has arrived. I mean, I think it's here, and I think what's happening in Africa is showcasing that. I believe that one of the smart things that the military junta in Niger did was, and we'll see if they continue to do this, was to focus on the removal of France, and they didn't bring in Germany or the U.S. or anything like that. I think that was the right way to play this. Whether they want to do business with the U.S. or Germany is a different subject altogether. But they're very focused on getting France out, and I think what that's done is that it's left the United States in a bit of a. The U.S. is kind of thinking about this. You can see that France wants intervention. It needs intervention. Otherwise, its entire position in Africa collapses, or it continues to collapse. But France understands that it needs the U.S. It's not going to get intervention, even with ECOWAS, if it doesn't have the U.S. on board. And it kind of has maybe half of the U.S. government on board, but there's another half of the U.S. government which is saying, we don't need this, and anyway, the coup is not directed at us anyway. It's directed at you guys, France. So, don't bring us into this. And the problem for France is they understand that they need the U.S. in order to intervene, or to get ECOWAS to intervene in Niger. But their problem is that if the U.S. comes in, they're afraid that the U.S. is going to push them out. Mm-hmm. So they're really in a tough position. If you're Macron, you're kind of pulling your hair, saying, "What do I do here? How do I get out of this?" And I don't think he knows, and that's why I think you're seeing his speeches are getting more erratic and more panicky, and he's just saying some crazy stuff now because he's lost it. But I think it was very smart that the military coup focused in on the removal of France. This was just about France. It wasn't about the U.S. It wasn't about Germany or the U.K. or anybody. This is just about France. We want France gone.
Absolutely. So we're at an hour and a half. I just wanted to do one last closing thoughts. What are your closing thoughts about Ukraine and how it fits into this larger geopolitical situation that is unraveling?
Well, in terms of Ukraine, I think that it's probably now, and I have to say this for Ukraine itself, a lost cause. And I think, people in Europe, in the United States, perhaps need to understand that whatever the outcome of the war is going to be, it is not going to be one that is going to preserve the Ukraine that we used to know from a few years ago. I mean, that is irretrievably lost. With this offensive was the last throw. And having failed, there is really no coming back. What we need to do in the West is, first of all, we need to start thinking about ourselves and about where we're going. And we've also got to understand that, our power, such as it was, is not what it used to be. And that attempting to exert it is all that it is doing is creating more and more misery and tragedy around the world and making us less and less popular around the world, or perhaps I should say more and more unpopular. We're pretty unpopular already, but even more unpopular, and ultimately even more isolated. And even if it doesn't all end in a smash, that's not going to be a good outcome for us. I'm going to just give one historical example. You know, I tend to do lots of historical examples, but let me just give one, which again, it's a country that I studied very carefully at university, and that is Spain. 16th century Spain, by far the most powerful country in Europe and arguably the world. It established the first world empire. And then in the 17th century, things began to go wrong. And there was high inflation in Spain. The economy was stagnating in Spain. Living standards were falling in Spain. Spain had commitments all over Europe, all over the world. Lots of people in Spain talking all the time about reform. We have to retrench. We have to reform. We have to rethink what we're doing. And every one of those attempts to carry out those changes was stopped, was blocked. The oligarchy that was in control of Spain, they would always say anything that you're trying to do, whether it's to, draw back on our foreign policy, carry out internal reforms, it is a betrayal of Spain. It's going to destroy the image and vision of Spain. It's going to contradict our values. And people talked in that way in Spain. And then, of course, in the 1640s, it all came crashing down. Spain crashed to a whole succession of massive military defeats. And its moment passed, and it became isolated in Europe. Its economy continued to go backwards. It became from being Europe's most important and advanced and powerful country into one of its poorest and most backward countries. In the 18th century, it became a satellite of France. And in the 19th century and the 20th century, it collapsed into civil wars. So that is a warning to what can happen if we don't revisit our, rethink our position. We've seen it happen before. Spain is one example. You can find lots of others, I have no doubt. But, we don't have an unlimited amount of time. And we're making ourselves more unpopular and putting ourselves in a more fragile position by failing to understand the realities that are taking place around us.
Well said. And I think squandering what little the West still has is going to put it in a weaker position when they finally do have to make the decision to coexist with the rest of the world. Alex, what are your closing thoughts?
No, but as Alexander is talking about realities, I was just thinking about Mitch McConnell freezing up, and to me that just it says it all. I wish that more. I wish that I would do this more often. I wish that more people would just look at the leadership, like really look at them and how they act and their body language and how they present themselves, and take a look at people like McConnell. Take a look at people like Pelosi, like Biden, like Kamala Harris, Macron, Trudeau. I think it tells you everything you need to know. And then this morning I saw Putin greeting Erdogan. Erdogan looks frail. Yeah. He does look frail. Putin, guy looks like he's not worried about stuff. I mean, that's the kind of body language, that's the kind of feeling that you're getting from him. I know you're watching a video, so you don't really know, but you look at guys like Zelensky. He's been wearing that green sweatshirt now for a year and a half. This is nonsense. This is nonsense. You look at Biden. This is nonsense. McConnell freezing up in public. This is what, the second or third time he's frozen up in public. This is the number one Republican senator. This is the guy calling the shots, supposedly, for the Republicans. And the other day, someone was on Fox News or CNN, and he's like, no, I hung out with McConnell in his office yesterday. He's all good. He's all good. He's as healthy as can be. This is reality. Look at the people that are dragging us into this. And I think you understand where reality is taking us. And we have to make a change. Something has to happen.
And I just want to remind people of something that you had said previously. Either the West makes the decision themselves, or it's going to be made for them. And I think that is the final takeaway on all of this. It really is the decision the West has to make. And if you make the decision yourself, you do it more or less on your terms. And if you wait until others have to make it for you, not so much. So I want to thank you both for taking time out of your day to join me here. I want to thank everyone who tuned in live. Why don't you both just tell everyone where they can find, follow, and support your work? I put all of the links in the video description below, and afterwards I will pin it in the comment section at the top.
You can find all of our channels on all the video platforms: YouTube, Rumble, Odyssey, BitChute, Telegram. Look for us on Telegram. Look for us on the Duran.locals.com. That's our main community right there. That's where you'll find us. If something goes wrong, you can always find us on the Duran.locals.com. You can find Alexander's channel. You can find my channel. You can find the Duran channel on all of the major video platforms. And you can also find the Duran channel on Twitter. We're starting to post on Twitter, and Alexander has an account on Twitter as well. Though there are two accounts. One of the account, A Mercuris, is the real account. There's another account which is posting videos. I mean, it's posting regular content, but that's not the real Alexander Mercuris.
I'm following that one.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So. Yeah, we're getting involved in Twitter as well, slowly, and we'll see how it goes. And hopefully Rumble, we're getting a lot of complaints on Rumble. I don't know what's going on with our videos. They're just not showing on Rumble for some reason. Hopefully it's a technical glitch, but we're trying to figure it out.
Yes, I was having problems on Rumble also, so I think it probably is a technical thing they'll sort out. I watch both of your videos separately, and then because you both do daily videos, and then I also watch the Duran, your collaborations every day on Telegram. If I watch nothing else, I will watch whatever you've posted on Telegram. So I highly recommend people follow your work, especially if you're waiting for an update on, say, Ukraine. Alex and Alexander do daily updates every single day, very thorough, highly recommended. Thank you again for tuning in. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. And maybe next time we'll try to do some questions and answers. And until next time, bye for now.
Thank you.